How did a cartoon woman become so controversial that Hollywood had to redesign her entire life? Betty Boop looked cute, tiny, musical, and harmless. But in the early 1930s, she was not harmless at all. She was jazz-age freedom drawn in ink: short dress, high heels, swinging hips, nightclub songs, and a voice that sounded innocent while the jokes around her were anything but. Then 1934 arrived, and almost overnight, the Betty audiences loved was softened, covered, controlled, and pushed into a safer world. Before censorship changed her, Betty Boop was one of animation's strangest miracles. She first appeared in 1930 in Dizzy Dishes, not even as the fully human Betty people remember today, but as a poodle-like nightclub singer with long ears and a flirty stage presence. That sounds bizarre now, but the early Fleischer cartoons lived inside that kind of dream logic. Characters stretched, melted, danced, transformed, and behaved like the city itself had gone mad after midnight. Over the next few years, Betty evolved from animal caricature into a human flapper, with spit curls, round eyes, a short black dress, and a personality that made her feel more adult than almost any animated character around her. And that is where the trouble began. Betty Boop was not created for the world of Saturday morning children's cartoons, because that world did not really exist yet. Her cartoons played in movie theaters before feature films, meaning adults were watching them alongside newsreels, comedies, dramas, and gangster pictures. The early 1930s were the pre-code years, a short, wild window before Hollywood's moral rules were strictly enforced. Movies could be sharper, stranger, darker, and more open about adult themes. Betty fit that moment perfectly. She sang in nightclubs, she danced on stage, men chased her, ghosts danced around her. Jazz musicians appeared in surreal dream sequences. These cartoons were funny, but they were not innocent. That is what made them electric. Betty was cute enough to become a mascot, but bold enough to feel dangerous. She was not simply standing beside a male hero, she was the show. In Minnie the Moocher, she runs away from home with Bimbo and enters a haunted world of skeletons, spirits, and a ghostly walrus animated from Cab Calloway's movements. In Snow White, from 1933, the fairy tale becomes a strange, icy nightmare full of music, death imagery, and surreal comedy. In Boop Boop a Doop, Betty works in a circus and faces unwanted attention from a ringmaster, turning a catchy phrase into something darker than modern viewers expect. That was the secret of pre-code Betty. She lived in a cartoon universe, but the pressure around her felt grown up. The Fleischer studio style made her even more powerful. Disney was building a cleaner, softer, more family-friendly brand with Mickey Mouse. Fleischer cartoons came from a rougher urban imagination. They felt like New York back alleys, jazz clubs, theater stages, and nightmare cabarets. The animation was rubbery, unpredictable, and sometimes unsettling. Betty did not belong to a fairy tale kingdom. She belonged to the smoke, rhythm, and danger of early sound cinema. But by the early 1930s, pressure was building against Hollywood. Religious groups, morality campaigns, local censorship boards, and nervous studio executives all worried that films had gone too far. Crime, sexuality, alcohol, suggestive costumes, and rebellious women were becoming targets. The Motion Picture Production Code had existed since 1930, but for several years it was not enforced with full strength. Studios could still push boundaries. Then, in 1934, enforcement changed. The Production Code Administration gained real power, and Hollywood films needed approval to reach major theaters. That is when Betty Boop became a problem. The censors did not see her as just a drawing. They saw her as a symbol. Her short dress, visible garter, nightclub behavior, flirtatious songs, and adult jokes all clashed with the new moral standards. If Fleischer Studios wanted Betty cartoons to keep playing in theaters, they had to change her. Not slightly, dramatically. The first obvious change was her appearance. The famous short flapper dress was made longer. Her neckline became higher. The garter disappeared. Her movements became less suggestive. The visual language that made Betty instantly recognizable was softened into something more acceptable. She was still Betty, but the danger had been removed from the design. The cartoon star, who once looked like she had stepped out of a jazz club, now looked like she had been dressed by a committee. But the censorship did not stop at the clothes. Betty's entire world became smaller. Before the code, she could perform on stage, travel through surreal nightmares, run into ghosts, fight off creeps, and move through bizarre adult spaces. After the code, her stories became safer and more domestic. She was placed in cleaner settings, more ordinary plots, and more wholesome situations. The cartoons pushed her away from being a nightclub performer and toward being a polite, helpful, respectable young woman. She could still be charming, but she was no longer allowed to be dangerous. That is the part many people miss. Hollywood did not only censor Betty's body, it censored her independence. The early Betty could feel like a rebellious female star. She was playful, confident, and sometimes vulnerable, but she had a spark that made the cartoons revolve around her. After 1934, that spark was managed. Her personality became sweeter and less provocative. The innuendo disappeared. The adult humor faded. Male pursuit became less threatening or less central. The jazz club energy gave way to safer comedy. Instead of feeling like an icon of the pre-code age, Betty started to feel like a character trapped inside rules written by people afraid of her original appeal. Her supporting world changed too. The Fleischer cartoons began adding safer companions and more conventional situations. Characters like Pudgy the dog helped move the series into cuter, family-friendly territory. This was not a bad idea by itself, but it changed the flavor of the cartoons. The early Betty Boop universe felt like anything could happen. The later one felt like everything had to behave, and audiences could feel the difference. The later cartoons were not without charm. Some had clever gags, energetic animation, and flashes of Fleischer creativity. But compared to the pre-code shorts, they felt restrained. The weirdness was toned down. The sensuality was removed. The adult edge was gone. Betty had been made respectable, but respectability was not what made her famous. The censorship solved the moral problem and created an artistic one. Once Betty stopped being bold, what was left that other cartoon characters could not do? That question slowly haunted the series. By the late 1930s, the animation industry was changing fast. Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs arrived in 1937 and showed audiences a new level of polish, emotion, and technical ambition. Disney's characters were already built for family appeal, so the code did not damage them in the same way. Betty, however, had been created from pre-code energy. She was not designed to be a safe domestic cartoon heroine. She was designed to sing, wink, dance, escape trouble, and bend the rules. Once the rules became stricter, her identity became harder to sustain. That is why the censorship of Betty Boop matters beyond one character. It shows how quickly a cultural icon can be reshaped when the moral climate changes. In the early 1930s, Betty reflected a world of jazz, nightlife, urban anxiety, female performance, and surreal humor. By the middle of the decade, Hollywood wanted cleaner messages, safer women, clearer morals, and stories that would not offend organized pressure groups. Betty was caught between those two Americas. The result was a cartoon makeover that was really a cultural warning. What exactly changed? Her dress got longer, her neckline rose, her garter vanished, her dancing became less provocative, her songs lost much of their adult edge, the nightclub atmosphere faded, the surreal horror and jazz sequences became less central, her stories became more domestic, more ordinary, and more morally safe. Her personality shifted from bold flapper to polite young woman, and perhaps most importantly, the cartoons stopped feeling like they were sneaking something past the audience. That loss of danger mattered. The early Betty Boop cartoons were not perfect. They contained racial caricatures and stereotypes that are unacceptable today, and any honest discussion of them has to admit that. But they were also historically important, because they captured a moment when animation was not yet locked inside the idea that cartoons had to be wholesome children's entertainment. They were strange little theatrical experiments, full of jazz, fear, flirtation, comedy, and chaos. Betty was the face of that freedom. When censorship arrived, that freedom narrowed. And yet, the strangest part of the story is this. The censors changed Betty, but they did not erase the version people remember. Ask most people to picture Betty Boop today, and they do not imagine the safer, toned-down version from the later 1930s. They imagine the pre-code icon, the black dress, the curls, the wink, the voice, the attitude, the character who seemed too alive to be controlled by ink. The version Hollywood tried to tame became the version that survived in popular memory. That is what makes Betty Boop's censorship so fascinating. It failed in the long run. The code could force studios to cover her up, rewrite her behavior, and shrink her world. But it could not make audiences forget why she mattered. Betty became legendary, not because she obeyed the rules, but because she arrived before the rules fully closed in. Her story is not just about old cartoons. It is about the battle between art and respectability. It is about how entertainment industries panic when a character becomes more powerful than expected. It is about how women on screen have often been celebrated first, then controlled later. And it is about how censorship can make something cleaner while quietly making it less alive. By 1939, the original Betty Boop theatrical series had come to an end. The character remained famous, but the moment that created her was gone. The wild pre-code world had been replaced by a stricter Hollywood, one where adult themes had to hide behind implication, suggestion, and coded language. Betty survived as an image, but the cartoons that made her dangerous were pushed into history. Then, decades later, viewers rediscovered the early shorts and realized something shocking. Betty Boop had not always been the safe, vintage mascot printed on mugs, shirts, and posters. She had once been one of the boldest animated stars in America. She had been funny, strange, musical, vulnerable, rebellious, and far more adult than her later reputation suggested. That rediscovery changed how people saw her. Suddenly, she was not just cute, she was evidence. Evidence of what animation looked like before the rules tightened. Evidence of what Hollywood feared in 1934. Evidence that a cartoon could become a battleground for morality, gender, business, and creative freedom. So why were the Betty Boop cartoons censored in 1934? Because Hollywood changed the rules, and Betty represented almost everything those rules wanted to control. She was too flirtatious, too modern, too musical, too strange, too tied to adult audiences, and too closely connected to the freewheeling pre-code era. The censors did not want a jazz-age flapper leading animated shorts into risky territory. They wanted a safer figure who would not provoke complaints. And what was changed? Almost everything that made her dangerous. Her look, her jokes, her settings, her movement, her stories, her relationships, her freedom, her world, but not her legacy. Because the Betty Boop people still remember is not the cautious version built after the code. It is the one Hollywood tried to soften, the one who danced before the curtain fell, the one who belonged to a brief, wild moment when cartoons were not afraid of shadows, jazz, desire, danger, or rebellion. In the end, Betty Boop was censored because she was too alive for the rules of 1934. And nearly a century later, that is exactly why she still matters.